It certainly is. This one involves an apartment complex where dozens of heroin arrests have already happened. And police say that yesterday's drug raid at the notorious Manhattan apartment complex probably will not be the last. The problem, they say, is now an international one. Heroin dealers coming up from Mexico to San Mateo County to sell their wares. Abby Goldman reports tonight on the growing Mexican connection.
Yesterday's raid at the Manhattan apartments, the fourth this year, yielded only a gram of black tar heroin and a handful of suspects. But a close look inside the place shows how much business is being done here. Razors are used to cut the heroin to put into plastic bags.
Every one of these scratches that you see on the counter of these cabinets is where deals have gone down. These are all scars, remnants of deals.
Over the past year and a half, more than 165 people have been arrested here for selling or using heroin. Virtually all the suspected dealers have been Mexican illegals. In fact, almost all the heroin dealers caught in this county over the past 3 years have come from the Mexican state of Michoacan.
They have the source. They can sell heroin cheaper than anybody else. They have basically chased what had been our traditional heroin dealers from the market.
Drug agents believe heroin made in the Michoacan city of Aguililla is hand-carried across the border by Mexicans who come to southern San Mateo County to sell it. Police say counting the number of Mexican heroin dealers here is like counting grains of sand on a beach. There's no organization, no Mexican mafia to track down, if you will. They're individuals who come here because there's already a large Mexican community. Housing is cheap, and there are plenty of buyers. But the dealers don't stay for long.
If they can come to the United States, if they can make $30,000 or $40,000, which is not out of the question, and be able to transfer that money back home, they can live quite well, maybe even set themselves up for the rest of their lives.
The assistant manager of the Manhattan apartments, herself from Michoacan, is familiar with that scenario, although not involved herself.
No keep the money over here. He left it to Mexico.
They send it all to Mexico?
Yeah.
Santos Salas, who brought his family here from Aguililla, despises the heroin trade, but $30,000, he says, would buy an estate back home. He'd be a rich man. Most Mexican dealers have no U.S. record, so they spend only 60 to 90 days in jail before being sent back to Mexico. To them, it's worth the risk.
The only way that we're going to have any control is by controlling the source in Mexico.
And that, frustrated county drug agents acknowledge, is out of their hands. In East Palo Alto, Abby Goldman, Channel 5, Eyewitness News.
Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia about what they can do in common to fight this war against illegal drugs. Colombia is home to the drug lords, Peru and Bolivia where most of the coca is produced, and the U.S. the customer. The president of Mexico will not be there. Mexico. Today it is no longer across the Florida coast, but via Mexico that most of the drugs from farther south reach the U.S. So at the summit, there'll be a missing link. Here's ABC's Beth Nissen.
This is how many Americans think of Mexico. A mean country, run by the cruel, overrun by the corrupt. A recent NBC miniseries broadly portrayed Mexican drug agents as accomplices in drug trafficking, Mexican officials as murderers of an American DEA agent. This is closer to the truth these days. Mexican drug police at a checkpoint near the Texas border, working to stop a flood of cocaine. In the past year, Mexico has become the primary funnel for cocaine en route from Colombia to the United States.
Nosotros quisiéramos, ¿verdad?
We would like for the consumption of drugs in the United States to diminish. Then our problems would diminish.
In many ways, this is not Mexico's war. The country does not produce cocaine. It has no domestic market for it. But Mexican President Carlos Salinas, in his first year in office, declared cocaine a threat to national security.
As the cocaine, as the drugs pass through Mexico, they do leave a path of corruption, violence, delinquency, criminality. Not a path like in the United States or like in Colombia, but a path nonetheless.
The government has made big catches along that path in the past year, a total of 37 tons of cocaine, the prosecution of a parade of drug traffickers, including notorious drug outlaws like Felix Gallardo, and the arrest of several previously untouchable Mexican officials on drug charges. But corruption remains deeply rooted in Mexico, and millions of drug dollars can only corrupt more. This is the man charged with weeding out drug trafficking and corruption. Deputy Attorney General Javier Coelho Trejo is Mexico's William Bennett, although officials here point out that Mexico's drug czar has real power. command of 1,100 drug police, a $53 million budget, and the authority to order investigations and arrests.
We
have 11,500 drug dealers in jail now. What does this mean? That in Mexico, impunity has come to an end.
The drug war has cost Mexico dearly. A nationally televised memorial service honored the 45 Mexican drug agents killed since early 1989. Yet despite its costly efforts, Mexico is having no greater success than the United States or any other country in intercepting cocaine. Helicopter pilots patrol the Sierra Madres, trying to catch drug planes as they refuel on the hundreds of airstrips scratched into the mountainsides. But drug planes are rarely stopped unless, like this one, they crash short of a runway. Tons of the powder get through every week in turboprops like this one, which was packed to the ceiling with cocaine when it was confiscated. Most drug planes land along the 2,000 unchecked miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. They offload, and the cocaine is often carried over by Mexican couriers known as mules. The United States now wants to put more air patrols, even military units, on the border. That terrifies Mexico, which has always been fearful of U.S. intervention, more so since the invasion of Panama.
Every time the U.S. exerts pressure on Mexico to do more on drug enforcement, it is simply because the United States is not getting anywhere in pursuing the real problem, which is drug consumption, drug addiction in the United States.
Shared intelligence is what the Mexicans say they need most. That and greater credit for their soldiering, their valor, in a war that is not of Mexico's making, but is occupying Mexico more by the day. Beth Nissen, ABC News, Mexico City.
Now, the latest addition to the NewsHour bookshelf. Drug kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's escape this week from one of Mexico's maximum security prisons made headlines around the world. Guzman was the longtime head of one of the most violent criminal syndicates in Mexico and the United States. Now, a new novel, The Cartel, by Don Winslow, offers some insight into both sides of the war on drugs, the narco traffickers, as well as law enforcement. Jeffrey Brown talked with Winslow recently.
Don Winslow, welcome to you. You have been writing about the violence in Mexico and along the border for a long time now. Why compelled to sort of be in the news this way?
You know, I live along the border, about 40 miles, and so we live in a border culture. Mexico's very real to us. We have people going back and forth all the time. I also think it's one of the most important crime stories in the world today. I'm a crime writer, so I want to be writing about the most important things.
And a continuing story. Even this week, we get news of the escape of El Chapo.
El Chapo Guzman, exactly. Yeah, you know, I've been writing this book, The Cartel, is a continuation of a book I did about 10 years ago and follows the war on drugs for 45 years. So I've been following, Chapo for 15 years. And past weekend's news, it felt like it came right out of the pages of my book.
Do you think that a novel, I wonder after having taken a crack at this in several different ways, does a novel capture something that the day-to-day journalism can't?
I think so. I think you can use fiction to get inside people's minds.
Inside their minds?
Inside their minds, and you let the reader look at the world through their point of view. As journalists, they're not often allowed to do or shouldn't do. So yeah, I think that novelists can sometimes approach a subject like this from a different angle that can be enlightening.
And I'm also wondering, because this is another discussion we have here, when you're dealing with something so horrific, right? You're trying to translate it. There is this term, the pornography of violence, right?
I've used it, yeah.
You've used it. How much do you show? Where do you use restraint? What's your stance vis-a-vis the reader?
I think that you have to make a very clean decision about this. I never wanted to sanitize the violence for the reader because I want the reader to understand what has happened down in Mexico over the past 10 years. At the same time, it can have a numbing effect, just as real-life violence has a numbing effect on the people who experience it. So I had to find different avenues of approaching it. So sometimes I wrote the actual event of violence. At other times...
When you say the actual event, you mean based on on, sometimes based on the actual event.
Almost all the time.
Almost
based on
all the
the
time.
actual event. Other times I would write people's reaction to it. A journalist coming across it, somebody coming to the scene later, and write more of the emotional and psychological reaction of someone coming on that scene.
And you'd have times when you say, this goes too far, I'm stopping here?
Yes. There were times where the violence was so horrific, I just didn't think a reader could absorb it. You know, and even though I believed that that's what had happened, there were times when I backed off it.
I read about you. I didn't realize that you had been a private investigator once in your life. You've done various things in your life.
Yeah.
But how much do you draw on in the books? How much research goes into a book like this?
Well, a lot. I mean, this was about 5 years of my life in terms of research and writing. And so you talk to DEA agents, you talk to drug traffickers, you talk to addicts, you talk to a lot of people, you read a lot of journalism, read a lot of books, court transcripts, trials, that kind of thing.
You did an unusual thing when the book was coming out, and you took out a full-page ad in newspapers calling for an end to the war on drugs. Why? Obviously cost you a fair amount of money, I suppose, to do something like that. Why do that?
Well, as I said, I've been writing about this war for 15 years. And I have been to the funerals. I have sat with the mothers who've lost addicted sons. I've sat with families of kids who've been killed in drug-related gang violence. I've been to the prisons. I've seen the effects. At some point in time, I felt I had to do something other than write a novel about it, that I need to try to make some sort of contribution, at least try to make some sort of difference in the real world.
There is a line in there, I want to pull out one quote, a direct line you see between the war on drugs and recent events in Ferguson, Cleveland, Baltimore, and elsewhere. What's the line?
Well, you can draw a direct line between the militarization of our police forces, and cops have told me this, and the events in Ferguson and Cleveland and New York, because it was the war on drugs that really militarized our police first, where police are going into these neighborhoods, smashing down doors, arresting young men. And that starts a hostility that continues to this day. One police officer, high-ranking police officer, told me, you know, they cut in half my community policing funds and instead gave me tanks.
And how far do you push this? You talk about legalization. You certainly talk about decriminalization.
Yes, I would push it all the way to legalization. Look, we've been doing the same thing for coming on 45 years, Jeff. And what's the result? Drugs are more plentiful, more potent, and cheaper than ever. It's not working. In no way do I mean to disparage the very brave and intelligent people, police officers, DEA personnel who fight this war, but we need to start looking at this as a social health problem that it is, and not a law enforcement problem or a military problem.
All right, the novel is The Cartel. Don Winslow, thanks so much.
Last month, when novelist Don Winslow published The Border, the final novel in his best-selling trilogy about America's drug wars, the New York Times said it landed right on the culture's front burner. As much as anyone, Winslow has charted the decades-long link between the power of the drug cartels and the flood of immigrants seeking a new life, and between what the author considers failed policy and countless deaths and ruined lives. NewsHour Weekend special correspondent Jeff Greenfield recently visited Don Winslow at his Southern California home, fittingly not far from the Mexican border.
President Trump's most popular talking points in the last few weeks, the caravans of thousands of Central American migrants headed toward the U.S. southern border.
It has dominated our political debate.
Build that wall. Build that wall.
It helped elect a president.
President Trump, you will not get your wall.
It triggered a month-long government shutdown.
Hey, hey, ho, ho, shelter's got to go.
And the president has declared it a national emergency.
Because we have an invasion of drugs, invasion of gangs, invasion of people.
It is the toxic mix of Mexican drug cartels, unspeakable violence, caravans of asylum seekers, and a major domestic political fight. Just 40 miles from the San Diego-Tijuana border, in the mountain town of Julian, California, novelist Don Winslow has spent 20 years chronicling the story of the drug wars that have triggered so much of this controversy. The horrific violence as cartels battle for supremacy. The murder of hundreds of journalists and officials that has driven so many on a perilous search for safety. His new novel, The Border, now at the top of many bestseller lists, is the concluding work of a trilogy that was born out of a single 2-decade-old news story.
I remember the date, September 20th, 1998. I get up in the morning, and the first thing I do every morning is I look at the newspapers. And that morning, in the San Diego Union Tribune, there was a story about 19 innocent men, women, and children slaughtered in a town just across the border because it was thought by the local cartel that one of them was an informer.
That story inspired Winslow to write 2005's The Power of the Dog, chronicling American efforts to battle the rise of a drug cartel led by a thinly fictionalized version of Joaquin Guzman, known better as El Chapo. Winslow thought that one book would be all, but the escalating violence and the escalating efforts by the United States to fight what it calls a drug war kept him returning to the story. He followed with the cartel in 2015, and now, with the border, Winslow has come to one stark conclusion. What is it about this drug war, about what's going on, that you think Americans most need to know and may not know?
That it's not the Mexican drug problem, it's the American drug problem. We point our fingers, increasingly so with this administration, at Mexico. Oh, those criminals are coming up. Oh, those drugs are coming up. Yes. Why? Because we buy the drugs. If I were standing on the other side of that border, of that proposed wall, I might want to build a wall because something like $65 billion in drug money goes south across that wall to fund basically terrorist organizations that are destabilizing Mexican society, Mexican politics, and the Mexican economy.
America's so-called war on drugs began almost 50 years ago, promoted by presidents from both parties.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. We've had more major drug dealers arrested than in any previous similar time in our history.
For Winslow, most of the efforts to fight this war, the rhetoric of presidents going back decades, the endless photo ops of drug seizures, even the recent conviction of cartel leader Guzman, El Chapo, have been exercises in futility.
And all you have to do is look at the numbers. Since he was captured and recaptured or re-recaptured, the importation of drugs into America has not fallen, it's risen. The number of overdose deaths have not fallen, it's risen.
And as for building a wall to stop the flow of drugs?
If you read the DEA's last 5 annual threat assessment reports, it says right in there what all of us have always known, that 90% or more of the illicit drugs that come through the Mexican border come through POEs, points of entry. There are 52 of them on the Mexican-American border, but 3 that really matter. And most of the drugs come in tractor-trailer trucks right through those legal ports of entry.
And it's at these 3 ports, San Diego, California, Laredo, Texas, and El Paso, Texas, through which an unstoppable flood of drugs flows into the United States every day.
1 every 15 seconds through El Paso, for instance. About 5,000 a day through these ports of entry. So there's no way that you're going to stop and search those trucks unless you completely shut down commerce between the United States and Mexico, which you cannot do because you will wreck the economies of 2 countries.
For Winslow, the whole notion that these travelers crossing the border pose the danger of violence is wrong-headed. In fact, he says most of these people are fleeing the violence of drug cartels, who often recruit children to act as drug mules on pain of death. And he took us to the mountains, where many are abandoned by their guides, to grapple with literally life-threatening weather.
Looking down at the desert floor, the kind of bitter irony is that the immigrants get dropped off out there, either coming across the mountains where they could freeze to death, or right down there in the desert just a few miles where they die of heat exposure.
Winslow's novels also paint a picture of powerful financial interests in the United States, banks, investment companies, that, wittingly or not, launder the drug profits. And after 2 decades immersed in this world, Winslow has emerged with a blunt, provocative answer to the question, what to do.
Well, I'd legalize drugs.
All of them?
All of them.
Control them? Just let them free market? Does it matter?
Listen, I'd like to see, us talk about any of those possibilities. What I know right now is that what we're doing, treating it as a law enforcement problem or, God help us, a military problem, doesn't work. Every horror story you can tell me about heroin and cocaine and the meth and all of them, right? And I've seen them firsthand, happens while they were illegal. Every one of them. So I think what we need to do is, yes, at least decriminalize, more emphasis on diversion programs, trying to get people treatment. But one thing we definitely want to do is take the profit out of these drugs, because it's the profit that is funding violent sociopaths to the points of billions of dollars a year.